Let's bring in Rachel Rizzo. She's a political analyst and director of programs at the Truman Center. She joins us from Washington, D.C. tonight. Good to see you again, Rachel. Well, let me ask you about what President Trump was asked earlier today. A reporter asked him if he's prepared both a victory speech and a concession speech, and he answered in an unusually somber tone. Do you think he senses that the polling numbers might be right after all?
Well, I think that's a great question that you ask. But I think that what's helpful is to point to the fact that for weeks, if not months, Trump has hinted that he may not concede even if polls show that Joe Biden is ahead. So I think that we'll have to see exactly what happens there. He has also said that he could declare victory, even if he is not the clear winner. But as we all know, that's not in the Constitution. So it really doesn't matter if he comes out and declares victory. But that could cause a lot of confusion. So that is definitely something we're concerned about and watching closely.
Every 4 years, the U.S. presidential election becomes the world's election, if you will. People all over the planet, they feel like they are a part of this process in some way. It's been a benefit for America in the past. This time around, though, it looks like a liability. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And it's really concerning to read reports that have been coming out from, human rights organizations saying that people need to be watching what happens with the elections in the United States to make sure that polls and votes are counted fairly and that people have their voices heard. And so you hear these reports, and the fact that they are coming out and being talking about the United States like that is just so concerning. And it shows just how far the United States has slid in the past 4 years during Donald Trump's presidency.
And when Trump was elected back in 2016, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she was the first European ally to congratulate him with conditions, a friendship based on shared values, she said. Merkel and Trump ended up sharing very little these past 4 years. Take a look.
Even before Donald Trump became U.S. president, it was clear the relationship wouldn't be easy.
Now, Merkel, what did she do? She's she's in the process of destroying Germany with the migration.
Once Trump did become president, she congratulated him on his election. But, in typical Merkel style, she threw in a subtle dig.
Germany and America are connected by values: democracy, freedom, respect for the law, and for the dignity of human beings, regardless of their origin, skin color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or political views.
Sexueller Orientierung oder politischer Einstellung.
This photo of Merkel facing Trump at a G7 meeting went viral, seen by many as a perfect illustration of their rapport. So was their first encounter, when Trump ignored Merkel's suggestion to shake hands.
Thank you. Thank you. Handshake? Okay. Head up. Thank you, fellas.
One of the biggest sources of disagreement has been NATO. Trump has attacked Germany without pause, saying it was not paying its fair share towards the alliance.
Germany, as you know, is very delinquent in their payments to NATO. And they're paying 1%, and they're supposed to be at 2%, and the 2% is very low. It should be much more than that.
When Trump tweeted racist attacks on this group of Democratic U.S. congresswomen, Merkel openly condemned his actions.
I firmly distance myself from the attacks, and I stand in solidarity with these women.
A strained relationship, but also opposite approaches, like on how to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and how to wear a face mask. Now, with Trump fighting for a second term in office and Merkel in her last year as chancellor, it may soon be time to kiss goodbye. The question is, how soon?
Rachel, Donald Trump, in many ways, he looks like or has become the anti-Merkel. Merkel is a scientist turned politician, Trump, a reality TV star turned politician. Merkel's handling of the pandemic has obviously been based in science. Trump's has been based, some would say, in PR, others would say denial. Is this an accurate description from where you're sitting?
I think it's a very accurate description. And just a few years ago, even when Donald Trump was elected as president, people started talking about Angela Merkel as the leader of the free world. And so I think it goes to show that even other world leaders look at Donald Trump as a president that can't really be trusted, as a president who flouts democratic norms. And I think in no relationship has that been clearer in how he and Merkel have interacted with one another over the last 4 years, and the sort of disdain that he has shown for her, especially when it comes to German defense spending and various other issues that have come up, like, for example, Nord Stream 2. So I think that if Donald Trump does is reelected, then it's really concerning to think about where that relationship might be headed.
Yeah, there are predictions that if Trump wins re-election, that this would be the beginning of the end of NATO, and that it would mean a total withdrawal of U.S. troops from Germany, maybe from all of Europe. I mean, that's what we're hearing on this side of the Atlantic. Are U.S. voters aware of what is at stake in terms of foreign policy in this election?
I think U.S. voters are aware of what is at stake, and there's good news here. American voters are very supportive of NATO, and so while Donald Trump has used disparaging words against the alliance over the past 4 years, that really hasn't translated into a decrease in support for NATO throughout the United States. Now, there is higher support among Democrats than there is Republicans, but I think it goes to show that Americans are, you know, they're multilateralists at heart, right? They want to see the United States as a leader on the global stage. And so even though Donald Trump has created problems with some of our strongest and our historical allies over the past 70 years, Americans themselves still see the United States as a country that's, worth being an ally to and worth being friends with. And so hopefully that's something that continues going forward.
Yeah, there are tonight a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic who hope that your words are true. Political analyst Rachel Rizzo joining us tonight from Washington, D.C. Rachel, good seeing you. We appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you. I have covered U.S. presidential elections since 1992, and this is the first election with violence and unrest as a possible result. The images of businesses in Washington, D.C. and New York City being boarded up. Preparations for a hurricane have become a bulwark against American anger. Now, the U.S. president is responsible for much of this acute hostility. In one of the presidential debates, he told the far-right group Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. Our correspondent, Amin Esif, has been traveling across the United States listening to people. He put this report together for us.
These images are fresh in the minds of many American voters. News of destructive protests and violent right-wing backlash dominated headlines for much of the summer and early fall.
I've been traveling the country and talking to voters. And if there's one thing Americans expect in November, more than a decisive victory for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, it's violence. That goes for Biden supporters.
With all these different extremist groups and militias, I'm concerned for people's safety.
They're not going to let up peacefully.
As well as Trump supporters.
I think if Biden loses, there will be violence.
There's going to be a civil war.
Yes, I believe we're going to hit the streets because we're not going to let it put up with. They're not going to put up with this, man. It's going to be a civil war if we don't do this. I mean, they're sitting there trying to take our guns and trying to do everything. It's not going to happen, man. We're going to stand up for what we believe in. We're going to do the American way.
But is this just talk? Or is the prospect of post-election chaos a legitimate concern?
One of the reasons people are talking about this is because it is happening. The data does show that there has been a rise in the number of terrorist plots and attacks in the U.S. in 2020. About 2/3 of them through the first 8 months were caused by white supremacists and violent far-right extremists, and about 20% by anti-fascists, anarchists, and other violent far left.
But it's not just analysts who are discussing the possibility of disorder in November and beyond. Law enforcement has already begun to prepare.
I've had conversations across state and local law enforcement agencies, federal agencies, FBI, Department of Justice, National Counterterrorism Center. There is concern about the potential for violence, particularly after the election, and also an increase in efforts to try to mitigate those risks by ramping up FBI penetration of some of the groups.
It's not surprising that many Americans are uncertain of how Donald Trump will act if he loses the election. He's been asked that very question and refused to give a clear answer.
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens.
Is Trump just dodging the possibility that he could very well lose to Joe Biden? Or is he really implying that he would refuse to accept the outcome of the election? When pressed another time on the peaceful transition of power, Trump said that yes, he would allow Biden to take office if he won. But some analysts say that Trump is trying to gain an advantage by casting doubt on mail-in ballots and other common voting practices.
He's basically telling the American people that our electoral system is unreliable. And not simply unreliable, that it's corrupt, that it's been rigged, and that the only way for the system to demonstrate its legitimacy is for him to win. It's an incredibly dangerous state of affairs.
Social media companies like Twitter and Facebook have promised to clamp down on calls for violence after the election. Like the law enforcement agencies, they believe a peaceful transition of power will require all hands on deck.
Well, things look good for Joe Biden heading into this election. He's had a consistent lead in the polls. Pollsters, however, have been wrong, like the last time in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was tapped as the next U.S. president. But despite her poll lead and winning the popular vote, America's electoral college system, it was a calculus not in her favor. As votes are cast this year, the latest polls give Joe Biden an even bigger national lead, 8.5 percentage points. So what lessons have pollsters learned from that 2016 debacle? And could we be looking at another upset? Well, tonight we're going to try to get some answers. I'm joined by Galen Druk, who hosts a podcast on politics for the analytics website 538.com. Galen, it's good to have you back on the show. Good to see you again. On your Twitter feed, I noticed you've pinned a tweet in which people can ask you about forecasting the election or to forecast the election. So let me start by asking you for a forecast. What are you forecasting?
Well, essentially, our forecast at 538 takes all of the polls, the national polls, the state level polls, and creates a probabilistic forecast of how likely it is that either candidate will win the election. So right now on election day, it was frozen at midnight last night. It shows that Joe Biden has a 90% chance of winning the election, and President Trump has a 10% chance of winning a second term.
All right, so that's a clear edge there for Joe Biden. But we all remember the shock in 2016. The polls got it wrong. Are they worthy of our trust this time around?
There's a lot of things to think about when we talk about trusting the polls. So first of all, the national polls were not very off in 2016. They projected a 4-point Hillary Clinton win, and ultimately she received 2% more votes. She won the national popular vote basically by 2 points in 2016. Of course, the national popular vote doesn't really matter in American elections. It's all about state level elections. So that 2-point difference is about the average polling error that we would expect in any election. Now, when we look at the state level polls in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which were the key states that handed President Trump his presidency, we saw that the polls were off by more than 2 points. They were off by a greater than average polling error. And what this came down to is a couple things. One, pollsters were not reaching enough people who didn't have college degrees. When pollsters call Americans, for some reason or another, more educated voters are likelier to answer the pollsters. And this time around, we see that pollsters have changed the way that they conduct their polls so that they properly weight people without college degrees. We also had more undecided voters in 2016, and they broke late towards Trump after the Comey letter to Congress saying that he was reopening an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, in 2016, about 12% of the electorate was undecided. This time it's only 4 or 5%. So there's less of a chance of a late breaking shift towards Trump this time. And ultimately, pollsters have done a lot of work. In 2018, they were pretty spot on for the midterms. So I think that we should go into tonight with faith in pollsters.
Do you think, though, Galen, is there a risk that in pollsters' efforts to not repeat 2016, is there a risk that they have overcorrected? I mean, they're telling us that Joe Biden has a lead, but could it be that the real lead that he has, or the edge over Trump, is much larger than what we're being told?
Absolutely. So polling error, as I mentioned, is very normal. It happens in most elections. We don't know how big it will be, and we don't know in which direction it will go. And so it's just about as likely that the polls are underestimating Biden as it is that the polls are underestimating Trump. We see that nationally, Biden is at about 8.5 points. In Pennsylvania, he is closer to 5 points, which right now is the likeliest tipping point state. So that's less of a solid lead in the state level races. But of course, there are other places that really Biden doesn't have to win, like Texas, Georgia, and Ohio or Iowa, where it's only a 1-point race. And if there's just a slight polling error there in Biden's direction, he could go from a somewhat tight race to all of a sudden a landslide.
Yeah. The historian Alan Lichtman, he has accurately predicted the outcome of every U.S. presidential election since 1984. He has his own formula known as the 13 Keys to the White House. Now, he told me on this program that polls are not worth our attention because they mean little, if anything. What do you say to that? I've got 30 seconds for you.
I say it's the best way we have to judge public opinion using the scientific method. The only other way to do it is subjectively by talking to voters here or there in a particular town or county. The most rigorous, open-minded, and thorough way to gauge public opinion in the United States, or frankly in any country, is to sample accordingly. And that's what pollsters do. And yes, they are off sometimes, and we should expect that to be the case. But that does not mean we should throw out the scientific method altogether.
All right, Cliff, that's a clear message right there. Galen Druk from 838.com. Galen, good to see you. We appreciate your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care.